My name's Chris Hebard, and I've had the pleasure over the last half dozen years or so of interviewing a lot of really interesting people about their spiritual journeys. And recently I met a contemporary mystic. His name is Robert Rabbin. Hi, Robert. Robert has written a bunch of books. He's got like 8 books out. And he has a very interesting history. And I'd like to share for a little while with you today that history. And then I'd like to delve into the deep end of the pool with you. And I would like to explore through the story of your health some very, very, I think, significant teachings that you have. So let's start with your journey, which began 50 years ago and brought you to India in the 70s to meet a guy named Swami Muktananda.
Well, I was a child of the 60s, and at that time the spiritual movement was just emerging in the culture. So, like others, I got into Carlos Castaneda, for example, some of the Zen material. I was studying Aikido and so on, but it was really fueled by a kind of existential questioning, which sounds like a cliche, but really when it hits you, it's actually quite real. And it was, the classical, who am I? And what am I doing here? And where am I supposed to go? And what am I supposed to do? So it was really the questioning that had been with me from an early age, even predating the 60s. When I was 11, I think, I first became aware of this questioning nature. And I began to follow the trail that these questions opened for me. In 1973, I was in India, had traveled overland there, and was originally going on a mountaineering expedition to Bhutan. That fell through. And in my subsequent travels, I ended up in the ashram of Swami Muktananda. And while I wasn't expecting to stay there for very long, and I really didn't even go to see him, I went to see a fellow that I had met in Turkey. As things happened, I spent 10 years studying with him, and he passed away in 1982, and I stayed in that organization for another couple of years and then began my own work in 1985.
And that work has been both in the nonprofit and the for-profit and the spiritual arena and outside of the spiritual arena.
There's been a lot of different forms to it, but on the inside, while there was a lot of changing and moving and going from one sector to another, there was a kind of coherence. And that coherence was following along the path that inner questions and inner answers created for me. So while it may have seemed like, well, I'm doing some corporate consulting here, and now I'm involved in spiritual activism, or I'm taking time off to write a book, or I'm moving from San Francisco to Austin to LA, and there was a coherence. There was an internal clarity that, while it wasn't laid out before me, it was more rather a moment-to-moment clarity, a moment-to-moment coherence that was created from listening, deep listening, and then taking what I heard inside and bringing it out into the world as the next thing that I was going to do.
This is jumping right into something that you wrote, which I really liked, which is the 5 principles of authentic living. And although I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, you've talked about that whole series of events actually in a few sentences. So just for the sake of our listeners, I just want to read off the 10 words that summarize.
Then you can remind me what they are.
I'm just going to do that, and then we're going to come back. So we're going to jump around a bit. But one of the beautiful things that Robert shared with me was that he could take everything that he had learned, or he felt at that point, and reduce it to 10 words. and that those 10 words really summarized 5 principles, and those 5 principles really were sort of the core of what he had learned over the decades of exploring this territory about what am I, who am I. And those are, number 1, to be present. Number 2, to pay attention. Number 3, to listen deeply. Number 4, to speak truthfully. And the last one, to act creatively. And without belaboring a lot of the history involved, if you track through Robert's books and take a look at what's going on, you'll see how that's manifested for him. Before I jump forward, though, I want to ask you one question about this clarity, that as things were going on, one thing seemed to go into another. Was that clear to you as it was going on, or was it clear to you in retrospect?
The framing within those 5 principles came about 1.5 years ago. So it was a retrospective realization of how I had been living for really my entire life. So I was living from these principles before I actually articulated the principles. The clarity itself would come moment to moment when I would, without even knowing I was doing it as a formula, when I would become present and pay attention and listen deeply, speak truthfully, and act creatively. Which, as you mentioned a minute ago, Chris, is everything that I had learned in some 50 years of self-study, but not what I had learned in terms of content, but what I had learned in terms of how to easily access that source of creative consciousness or awareness within myself. So it's a very important distinction, I think, between generating a lot of content as distinct from how do I find my way to that center inside myself, from which place all the other content has ever come from. So yes, the clarity that I use to move about in the world would come as soon as I would be still and listen, and then bring it out in terms of speaking and acting. That's really important, because if I didn't do that, then that internal insight would quickly convert by itself to confusion. It had to come outside and be implemented in the world so that the inner and the outer really became one whole place. It's not really the inner and the outer even, we'll just say those for distinctions, but it's really, that's the integrity of being that includes both. And it's my view also that everyone has as much access as I do, or you do, or anyone, as my teacher did, to that place in themselves where they can find out exactly what they need to know for themselves each moment of the journey. Those are the 5 principles for that.
I like what you just said. The integrity of being.
The wholeness, the integrity as in wholeness.
Yeah.
Is very important, because otherwise we'll end up living split. We'll end up living with a sense that we may have some inner realization or knowing, but then when we move out into the world, we get confused because we don't see it out there. So we have to bring that internal knowing, that inner sense of insight into the world. We have to, in a sense, actualize it or make it real through action. We can't stay in that internal, elevated, almost transcendent place. It's not whole enough. It's not big enough. It's just one place in a gigantic totality. So I think it's really important, in order for our lives to begin to take on the, the clarity that we can have inside, that we speak and act from that place, and then continue to listen. So we don't really want to go back asleep. So that it's really how we move is constantly within those 5 principles, which is really to say that we're living from accessing that inner place of conscious awareness, and then immediately, without any separation, bringing the inner out into the world. And one of the dangers is once we get an insight and we think we have some answer to a question or a dilemma, now we've got that sorted for a while, and we tend to stop listening. But my view is no, listening is as is breathing. You don't take one breath in the morning and call it a day. Well, you could, but it's probably going to be your last day. But so it is with listening. So it is with listening, which is right there in the middle of those 5 principles, and is another way of saying what meditation is. But it's got to then come out. And even as we're speaking what we've heard, even as we're acting what we've heard, we have to still become present, which I want to quickly define because we can hear that term a lot. And for me, it means to not have our existence be defined or determined by the thought stream, by the thoughts and emotions of the mind. That's all. It doesn't mean to simply become more present in terms of sense perception. It includes that, but it's also bigger and different. So we can't really listen until we first become present. All we'll hear is our mind chatter. So to be present and pay attention, and then listening deeply. Okay, listening. Beneath the noise of the mind. Now, I know clearly where, when, and how to take the next step in my life. But I have to then take that, don't I? I can't just hold the knowing of it. I have to take that by speaking and by acting in the world. So it's really, so those 5 principles really represent how we can live without ever breaking connection to that source of consciousness in ourselves.
You wrote this book, and I'm fast forwarding you. And in March of 2011, you said that something happened and that you didn't, quote, see this coming. You expected at that point to be talking about what we're talking about right now?
I had been living in Australia for a number of years and came back to the States in May of 2011, I think, with the idea that having just written this book, The 5 Principles of Authentic Living, I was going to then go forth and enlighten the world with my masterpiece that had taken 50 years to write. And that's when I thought, well, I've got another 20 years of which to do that. I just turned 60 or 61 and thought, great, here we go. It took me longer than I would have liked for this gem to come out, but there it was, and I felt this is really what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And so I came back to the States to begin teaching that, and that's when.
Is that so? At some point along the way, I think I'm correct that you were experiencing actually back pain.
Yes. As soon as I came back, and actually a little bit before I left Australia, which would have been around the first part of 2011, I had been experiencing back pains, which had been diagnosed as a disc spinal issue and was going to chiropractors and osteopaths and so on. And it didn't get better, but it didn't get worse. And it was, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being paralyzing, out of your mind pain, it was a 4 to a 6 until I moved back here. And then almost overnight, it went up to a 9 or a 10. And was in months of really, really, really acute, paralyzing, drop to the floor pain. And went for more X-rays and an MRI, and it kept being diagnosed as disc issues, and began and continued that path of chiropractors and physical therapists and so on. But it didn't get better, and it got worse. By then, I was walking with canes and crutches, and it was very difficult to get around, but I had committed to do a week-long retreat in Bali. This was in November of last year. And so I did that. I flew from the States to Bali and did the retreat, and it had gotten really worse, and realized I couldn't make it back to the States. I couldn't fly that distance. I was just in too much pain and physical disability. So I went to Australia for a few months to stay with some friends. So I had already moved from Australia, but went back thinking, well, it's closer to Bali. I'll get there and see what I can do. And that's when I kept deteriorating until one day, as it happened, it was Christmas Eve this past year, that I told my friends, look, something is really wrong, and said words that I don't think I've ever said before, which is, take me to the hospital. Right. And they did, and I was admitted, and a few days later, I was diagnosed as having stage 4 lung cancer. And the pain in my back was because, according to that diagnosis, what my spine and pelvis were riddled with tumors. And there's a big hole in my spine and all of that. So that at least explains why none of the treatments worked. That's right.
So, metastasized.
That's right.
So you fly back to the United States, and my understanding is you fly back with a single bag in your hand.
Well, they had given me a prognosis of a few months to live. They did give me some radiation right away, which relieved some of the pressure and prevented paralysis, which I was about 2 or 3 days away from. So they did do that, but they still said, look, because of this, the metastasized tumors were so widespread that even with chemotherapy, you've got a few months. So I didn't have much anyway, but I gave the few things that I had away and came to the States with a carry-on, thinking, well, I was going to come back here and organize my affairs and, move to the next life, as we say. Right. I came fully expecting and prepared to do that.
One of the notes that I read was that this notification from the doctors triggered a change in you, which was you called it a full stop, I think, just a complete and full stop. When I first met you, it was March, and so maybe later. So in between that period of time when I met you, I was sort of curious because I wanted to discuss death with you. Fear of death. And when I met you, it was very clear to me that you weren't experiencing this. And then later on, I talked to you, and you told me about this period of time. Fear of extinction. So wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because we're now going into chemotherapy, and then there's some things that are going on spiritually in that journey as well that I'd like to explore with you that I find tremendously interesting.
I came back from Australia the middle of January. And from the middle of January for about three weeks or so, I was preparing for my demise. And I was quite at peace with that. My mind wasn't angry or afraid. I've always lived the life that I've wanted to live, and I felt very full because of that. I didn't have any regrets. And I've always had a sense of death and life being pretty connected anyway. And it had some near-death experiences along the way. So I felt that, well, this is just your time to go. So my mind was at peace and relaxed. But there was something else that arose in me. and this is what I think where you and I had chatted about. And what I said was it was a more than a fear of death. It was a kind of terror. I like what you said a moment ago. It was a terror of extinction. It really wasn't about fear of death.
Amen.
It was a terror of extinction that wasn't in my mind or my emotions. It was somewhere else in me that I could, once it started to be noticeable, I would begin to observe that and go, wow. Not that I was taken over by it, although in looking back, I'll also say that I did have a lot of shock and trauma to my system. Not just from the diagnosis, but from a year of a lot of pain and all kinds of things that were going on. So my body was quite traumatized. But then there was this other thing that came up. And I lived with that for a while, kept observing it and noticing it. There wasn't anything I could do about it. It still didn't infiltrate my mind or emotions. It was this other part of me that manifested this terror of extinction, different than fear of death. Then I moved from San Francisco, where I had just started out, and then moved to LA, where you and I are sitting in my little ashram, as I like to call it, in Los Angeles. And I moved here in February and began chemotherapy treatments. But I was still living with that terror of extinction. And then when I started my chemotherapy treatments, it seemed to exacerbate that, in the sense that my disorientation plunged me deeper into that, not just that terror of extinction, but just into worlds that I don't really know how to describe, just way out there. But I want to just get to at least this part of it, which is, at one point, that terror disappeared. At one point, it disappeared. And I can't actually say if it was in an instant or if it was over the course of 2 or 3 days or a week or even a month, because for about 3 months during my chemotherapy, I was living in a fairly altered state of consciousness that I had never experienced before. So somewhere in there, that just disappeared from my system. And as that happened, there was an extraordinary full-bodied relaxation. It sounds like a very small word compared to what happened, but it was a relief, a relaxation, a letting go, and an opening that touched all the aspects of my being, to where I can say now that I actually did die. And not only did I die, but I passed through whatever this terror of extinction that lives wherever it lives, passed through that into some other place where it's just so different, because both the fear of death and the terror of extinction are not in me anymore. And so it's brought me to an entirely different experience of being alive.
Yes.
That I really don't think had anything to do with the cancer diagnosis or the chemotherapy treatments.
Release. Complete and total release.
That's what I experienced at some point in those weeks you had commented, Chris, off camera on a blog post that I had written chronicling some of those experiences called
Pony Ride to Oblivion.
Pony Ride to Oblivion, thank you.
It's
and
unbelievable.
And that's what it felt like is usually after a chemotherapy infusion, I would spend 3 or 4 or 5 days in a kind of oblivion. But I don't think it was exclusively a reaction to chemotherapy. I think it was in part, in fact, I think it was in large part of the spiritual process that was really what this cancer is about. But at any rate, and it was in those journeys to oblivion, which is the only way I know how to describe where I went to. There was awareness, but it was so far from awareness of anything that it seemed like there was nothing but oblivion. But then I would slowly come back, and each time I went, I came back with less and less, and then one day I came back from oblivion, and nothing came back with me. There was just the awareness, and that's continued over these last number of months. So I talk about the cancer as really being an initiation into a way of living that is on the other side of death and extinction, and is in stillness and silence, because nothing came back from one journey. There was just the awareness, not of, but just awareness. Now I'm aware of you, we're talking, but nothing historical. So the sense of release of everything was not only a sense of organized, coherent, rehearsed personal history, that's gone, but time itself is, the structure of time is virtually non-existent. The kind of leaning forward that I used to do, leveraging this moment to the next moment, which we do, and in some cases it's even an intelligent way to live because we want to prepare our future or realize our goals. So there was a kind of leaning out of now into the future. You know, I was sort of here, but also what can you do for me? So I was always looking at leveraging the degree to which I was present with things that were occurring, but leveraging them into some future state. That's all gone. There's no leveraging, there's nothing to look forward to. There's no life ambitions, there's no real desires. There's just, it's all different. But when I look at it, when I'm talking with you about it, I can hear myself say those things and realize intellectually I've known those things for many years. But it's an altogether different thing when one day you come back from a journey and you don't bring anything back with you. And you don't even have your carry-on bag. You just don't have anything. And I don't think cancer has given me any of that. I don't think radiation or chemotherapy, I don't think any of those things had anything to do with it. I think it was always, as is true with everything in life, what is your response to something? So I was given a diagnosis. So one day I had stage 4 lung cancer. Okay. What is my response to that going to be? And I thought from the beginning that the diagnosis was not the reality. The reality would be determined by my response. The diagnosis was a kind of, I mean, it was real. You know, I could see the pictures and holes in my spine. I couldn't walk, which now I can walk quite fine. But I felt that it was a suggestion. The prognosis, which they had given me as a few months, I thought from the beginning, no, I'll determine I'll determine what happens by my response. and which is really how I've lived my whole life, and I think a sensible and intelligent way to live, which is we meet life and we meet circumstances and situations and conditions, and what is our response going to be, and where are we going to respond from? My first inclination, which you can even see on a videotape that I did before I left Austria, right out of the hospital, was to escalate my desire to share what I had learned along the way. So it wasn't to retreat, it wasn't to go into some kind of sense of I'm going to die, or it wasn't to become an expert on cancer. It was to do what I'd been doing for many years, but in an accelerated way. And when I came here to set up a little healing center for myself to go through chemotherapy, it was always intended as a, in fact, I named it the greatness of being. I said, this is going to be a place dedicated to greatness of being. And in the few months I might have left, that's what I thought I had at the time, I'm going to escalate my love affair with everything that had to do with the full realization of self, and not dance around the edges of it, which I'd been doing for years. Another blog post that's come to mind was in which I shared how I realized I had stayed a little bit on the edges of that. Hadn't quite gone all the way. Well, I've got time for it, or something else. And now it was, no, what is your life really about? What are you really about? And whatever it is, get to it now, fully. So I did. And my response was my spiritual response. I've been on a spiritual path for 50 years. So it was, all right, you've got a few months left to live. What are you going to do with it? Well, what I was going to do with it is give all my books away for free, which is still available on the website and digital products, and make my little ashram, my greatness of being environment, available to anyone who wants to come and speak with me. And I was going to just live in a deeply meditative state and forget everything that was a distraction or an entertainment, so to speak. And that's what happened. And along the way, I don't think I have cancer anymore.
I wanted to footnote this because this is a recurrent theme, and I don't want to spend more time than we need to on the issue of cancer, but I want to summarize my view of it and my takeaway on it is that cancer is a metaphor for whatever it is we need to be looking at right now, whatever that obstacle may or may not be, and it's the perfect part of what we need to complete our sadhana. It actually, to me, represents, coming back to what you were saying before, something about the integrity of being. And from this perspective, it's about seeing what's going on, which is incongruent with what I know to be true, and what's really important. And that needs to be going on right now and at all times, and that's part of the beauty, I think, of this metaphor and this story, although the results are remarkable. You also have written about the approach to life, and I have clipped a couple paragraphs out of something that, if you don't mind, I sort of like to read and then get your comments on, because sure. I think it's a nice place to leave people on the heart of what you're talking about. This has to do with changing things. Anything that might seem to be in need of change. And this is quoting you. In order to affect the change in the world, in order to get people to create, not from the good idea of it, or showing profitability of it, or arguing for it, but from the inevitability of it, because it's a reflection, it gets me every time, of their state of consciousness. We have to embody this transformed consciousness. We have to show what the idea points to. Then, really what we're doing is affecting the state of consciousness and letting the people who work in these areas apply it, and inevitably the vision will be realized. J. Krishnamurti said it beautifully. The crisis is not out there in the world, in society. It's in our own consciousness. Pretty good. Which brings me back to what I suppose is my point for today. We don't want to lose the focus on our own transformation for the busyness of transforming society or anything. Realization has to be connected to how we live, or it has no integrity of being. It has no wholeness. It's one movement, insight and action. It's very easy, though, to get caught in the action and to get caught in what's wrong out there and think we're going to transform and fix it. That really struck me like a lightning bolt when you said it. I was in a group of people when you shared that, and I've read it subsequently, and I think it speaks a lot to what you're talking about right now.
When I came back from one of those journeys to oblivion and didn't bring anything back with me, one of the things that I noticed I didn't bring back with me was this sense of time. And another thing was I didn't bring back a belief in language to represent reality. I'm going to try to keep this very grounded and practical.
Here we are having a conversation.
But
I understand.
It has to do with the first principle of be present. When we're present, in the way that I mean it, we are no longer living in the thoughts from the mind, thoughts and emotion, but it also has a relationship to the languaging with which we express thoughts. So the whole, all of language has fallen away as being something other than to give practical direction. Could you pass the salt, or something like that. So there's nothing left. So I don't believe really in language as a place to hide behind, to take refuge in the ideas that we give languaging to. So there's only our actions, there's only what we do that can speak for our consciousness. To hear someone describe or define a non-dual reality in which the self doesn't exist and there's only consciousness and so on, we've chatted about that. To me, that has no import, meaning, significance. It's because it only has meaning if you are alive in the world of language in which those things have meaning. But once you've moved to the place of stillness or silence, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't, you just kind of go, what are you talking about? So we're left with how we are to represent who we are. And where is that self coming from? Where are we living from in us? So it's very important that we accept the unity of the inner and the outer, the insight and the action, as being one whole expression of self. And that we look really to how we are, not to the stories we tell about why we are this way or how we are this way, or not justifications or rationalizations, because we can rationalize anything, can't we? We can justify anything. So we don't want to use that anymore, we just want the behavior itself to communicate something. But then it's also true that when we stop projecting all of these thoughts and languagings onto the world, that the world changes in the degree that we lose fascination with thought and language to represent reality. It actually conceals reality. So the world that we want to change becomes very different the more we ourselves become, let's say, empty of self, if you will, if I could say that. So the world itself becomes different. And we start realizing, well, the world out there really isn't different than the world that I have in here. In 2003, I think it was, or 2004, I started a couple of projects that were coincided with the presidential elections in the states at that time. Truth for President, and followed by Radical Sages. And those were both initiatives that I launched to get the yogis and meditators into the electoral process. I wanted to get them involved in politics and in the voting booth. You know, this is we wanted to get George Bush out of office the second term. So I want to really change the world in that regard, and we can change the world surely because if we got all of the cultural creatives, the meditators and yogis, and got them to express their consciousness in the voting booth, then we would make a big difference. Well, I worked as long and as hard as I could, and we all know the results. I'm not taking the full blame for it. But now, and I really did, I gave myself to that absolutely fully, and wrote some 40 editorials that were widely published, and did a lot of things for those couple of years around making a change out there. Now here we are in 2012 with presidential elections 2 months away, and I'm not doing anything about that. I don't have any urge at the moment to change out there. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm not suggesting we don't, because to me we work both sides of the streets at the same time. I'm just saying that as a result of my own deepening experience of self, capital S, or as a result of what has changed in me, I look out at the world and see as many shocking things as before, but I see now with complete lucidity the shocking things are expressions of their awareness, which of course we all know intellectually, but I can see it like someone has painted a drawing, a picture. A child has made very picture. Here's the person and here's what's in their minds and in their hearts, and see how these are kind of confused and in pain and full of sadness. Well, now do you see how they're acting that out here, and that's what's happening in the world? Well, yes, I mean, I did get that, but wow, thank you, this is super lucid. Mm-hmm. And to where you can't, there's, in a sense, there's not even an out there to change. There's the place that we all create individually and collectively from inside out. And so what's become apparent to me is whatever change we want to effect first and so importantly, have we embodied that change, which means become that. Not that it's in this physical body per se, but the embodiment is, are we that? Do we stand for that in our speaking and in our actions? Or are we the same as everyone else, but we've just created a different story as to why? Or that we point to some good works, in quote, that we're doing out in the world to excuse our bad behavior.
This has been very beautiful for me. This is a nice way of putting it, because I didn't know how to put it coming into this conversation, but it's about the integrity of being. And it's about the only journey that one can ever take. It's your journey. And I just need to thank you. This was this was a very intimate thing that we talked about today. The story about cancer could have been the core of it, but it's not. And I think we have addressed what the heart of this whole thing is. And I just thank you for sharing it.
Someone the other day was talking with me about simplicity. Oh, it was a fellow from North Carolina who had emailed me. And I haven't met him, but he's a Facebook friend. And he wrote and said, Robert, I've been using your 5 principles with my students and my clients and with myself for about a month. And he said, it's like genius. It's so simple. He said, but when I tell my students and clients about them, they think it can't be this simple. He said, what do you have to say about it? I said, well, why do we so love complexity and so doubt simplicity? And having been on this spiritual journey for many years, and ending up where I am today, it's stunningly and spectacularly simple. The 2 seminal questions, really, in the spiritual life are, who am I and how shall I live? But you can't hear that or those answers from someone else and take them as yours. That's just what my teacher used to say was just gossip. It's rumors. Who am I and how shall I live? Well, be present, pay attention, listen deeply. Speak truthfully, act creatively. Is not anyone telling you the answers to those questions, but is rather saying, if you will go there to that place in you that you can get to instantly, you will know everything you need to know to take the next step in your life and to feel fully and deeply at peace and satisfied and whole. But you have to do it. You have to use, you have to embody, you have to do it. You can't just keep talking about it. You can't keep reading about it. You can't keep studying it. You have to do it. But that's how simple it is. If we will do that, everything will be different. If you will listen to your own self, not once, not twice, but as you breathe, there's nothing you won't know for yourself. And when it comes to you, even though your mind might come in later and doubt it, it will come to you in a way that you recognize as truth for you. Not truth with a capital T, but truth for you. The truthful next step, the truthful next way to be in your life. Confidence in your own being, wholeness. And if we were to do that, then wherever we go in the world, it would have to be different by virtue of the frequency we would be emitting just from being whole within ourselves.
Beautiful.
And that would be a good thing to do, I think.
The timing of this conversation couldn't have been better.
Well, I'm glad you got some value from it. I am, truly. Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you very much.